Hey guys, Dumelang. What's good? What's cooking? What have you been up to? I hope you're great. What's good? Sorry. What's good, everyone? Welcome to this video. Welcome to Enough Said, and I'm your host, Anintire. I'm joking, Anintire Tato. So the topic for this episode, well, first of all, let me start with the series, right? So this is like a random thought type playlist series where I just thought it'd be interesting if I just inserted my comments or my thoughts on whatever was happening in and around me based on the time in which that we shoot this video, right? So with regards to this particular series, it's really inspired by the recent events where based on when I'm shooting it, January, if I'm not mistaken. Yeah. So it's the 31st of January and it's the Sunday of Mac G's podcast and the uproar with regards to the podcast. There was a lot of transphobia and homophobia in general expressed in that podcast, and I'm sure we all know what happened on Twitter with regards to that. So outside of that, there was also like a really cool video essay that I saw from a YouTube user, or is it a YouTube user? Is that how you call? Anyway, a YouTube user named Kansani. I'll link the video below, but I'm sure it'll pop up on screening, about like boys in dresses, specifically cis-het men and the privilege, specifically cis-het white men in power or positions of popularity, and them being in gender neutral and or traditionally feminine dresses. So found it really cool. I thoroughly enjoyed that video. Cool. But this definitely, like, just everything that happened during the week made me think about like this motion that I had experienced a couple of years ago. So I'm sure it's like 2018, 2017. I'm not necessarily sure. I think the tournament was Gauteng Open, and there was this particular motion. It was in like the final rounds, right? And it was, this house believes that the trans movement should actively seek to separate themselves, their issues, and the collective identity from the LGBTQIA plus movement in their campaigns and in their public consciousness, right? So first of all, I don't remember anything that happened in that round. Like, I think I remember who was in the actual debate. I'm not sure, but I think Bunziki were in the debate. I'm not like, I think they even won the tournament. I wouldn't be surprised if it was like the finals motion, but I'm not sure. But I don't remember what was said like at all. What I do know is, after that tournament happened and after I experienced that motion, because it also happened in another debate tournament, I wanted to have this conversation like just on my radio show, Kotwana FM. The show was on the beat. It was a music specialist show. Amazing. So I had this feature called Off the Street, where I just spoke about, it was just like a social commentary, cultural commentary insert, right? So I wanted to have this conversation on that platform and just invite like the generic LGBT community in South Africa. One of the other reasons why I wanted to have that conversation at that point in time is it was recently after I had watched Lebogang Rasiteba's The People versus the People, right? And that was the first time in that documentary episode, in that docuseries, that I had seen LGBT or queer individuals or trans individuals speaking on any matter generally. So it's like, okay, shit, like, we're moving forward. There's some form of upward mobility. I can have this chat finally. But like, awkwardly enough, it was very, very, very unsuccessful. There was like a lot of hostility, I feel, in the responses that I got and the different people I interacted with, which is fine, I guess. And it was just uncomfortable, man. And there was a lot of like people referencing me speaking from a place of privilege because I was somehow like, like the assumption was that I was straight, so it was like super awkward because like, what are you talking about whatever. So anyway, here we are, and I just thought that it'd be like really interesting having this conversation now because I've been thinking about it the whole week, right? So cool. Just for context, for people that don't necessarily understand what trans individuals are, or who they are rather, for transgender and transsexual people, this process commonly involves, sorry, rewind. Transgender people have a gender identity or gender expression that differs from the sex that they were assigned at birth. Some trans people who desire medical assistance to transition from one sex to another identify as transsexual. Transgender, often shortened as trans, is also an umbrella term in which, in addition to including people whose gender identity is the opposite of their assigned sex, it may include people who are not exclusively masculine or feminine. Other definitions of transgender also include people who belong to a third gender or else conceptualize trans people as a third gender. The term transgender may be defined very broadly to even include cross-dressers. So being transgender is distinct from sexual orientation. Trans people may identify as heterosexual, homosexual, bisexual, asexual, or may decline to label their sexual orientation altogether. The term transgender is also distinguished from intersex, which is a term that describes people born with physical characteristics that quote-unquote do not typically fit binary notions of male or female bodies. The opposite of trans is cisgender, which describes persons whose gender identity or expression matches their assigned sex. The degree to which individuals feel genuine, authentic, and comfortable within their external appearance and accept their genuine identity has been called transgender congruence. Many trans people experience gender dysphoria, and some seek medical treatment such as hormone replacement therapy, sex reassignment surgery, or psychotherapy. Not all trans people desire these treatments, and some cannot undergo them for financial or medical reasons. Many trans people may face discrimination in the workplace and in accessing public accommodations and healthcare. In many places, they are not legally protected from this discrimination. And based on what was just said, we can then contextualize this discrimination as transphobia, right? Which is the dislike or prejudice against transsexual or transgender people. So, sidebar, as I was doing my research, I noticed like there was a lot of conflation, or I came across a lot of articles rather, where, there were comparatives between trans individuals and drag kings and queens. There seems to be this common myth where people assume that a drag king or queen is trans. So I found this really cool article by theconversation.com that unpacks that. I'll link it down below. And I also found this cool article from vox.com. So the LGBT group GLAAD explained transgender women are not cross-dressers or drag queens. Drag queens are men, typically gay men, who dress like women for the purpose of entertainment. Be aware of the difference between trans women, cross-dressers, and drag queens, and use the term preferred by the individual, right? This distinction is very important to the LGBTQ and trans advocates because it helps show the permanence of someone's trans identity. So being trans isn't a matter of dressing up in different clothes. It's a permanent identity that follows people throughout their entire lives. And while some trans people may enjoy dressing up in exotic outfits to entertain others, the act of dressing up in clothes to match one's gender identity reflects only one part of what it is to be trans. So similarly, being a cross-dresser or drag queen or king doesn't mean that people identify with a gender different from the one that they were assigned at birth. Some drag kings or queens may even be straight and cisgender, meaning they identify with the gender assigned to them at birth and only dressing up for entertainment purposes. Okay, awesome, cool. So I think like in terms of like having this conversation about like this house believing that like the transgender community, because I do think it's an interesting conversation. This house believes that the transgender community should like separate itself from the broader LGBT community. We need to go into like the historical context. Sorry, you guys see me looking down quite a lot because I have notes here. Like this is quite a hectic conversation. Cool. So trans and non-gender conforming women of color were not only the backbone of the LGBT rights movement, but they were actually at the forefront of the movement. So said women were Marsha P. Johnson, Sylvia Rivera, and Miss Major Griffin Gracie, right? So while they were at the forefront and the backbone of this movement, right? They pioneered the movement, so to speak. They were actively and fairly marginalized even within this movement in favor of the quote-unquote more palatable gay rights movement, right? So, cool. So right now, this is where we go into like the harms or basically like the effects of being marginalized from a movement pioneered by trans individuals, right? So one, of the facts that I saw when I was doing my research is like trans individuals are like disproportionately killed a lot more versus like other individuals in the LGBTQIA plus, right? At very large scales. Very recently in 2018, actually, there was like a lot of like hostile rhetoric against the trans movement, where like in 10 states, 18 bills, if I'm not mistaken, were passed against transgender rights, right? Cool. So this obviously exacerbates an already existing problem. Cool. On top of that, like there's really large like unemployment and like lack of access to education, I'll say, within the trans community, more so for like individuals that actively are seen visibly to be trans, you know? So what we see in the media, for example, like if you watch media, a lot of the roles that people get or that are portrayed rather in terms of like the trans umbrella is sex work. Like I watch a lot of what is it? I was gonna say CSI, Law and Order Special Victims Unit, and there's this one particular character who's a sex worker, and in general, the storyline with regards to that character, and surrounding that character is with regards to like trans individuals being like sex workers. More so, like the trans individuals that are sex workers in film and television usually have like some sort of like really graphic, really like terrible, like violent acts performed against them, so it's kind of uncomfortable to watch. But when you put this back into like modern day and like reality, is the reason why trans individuals or trans women rather actively opt for sex work. I won't even say actively, you know. I just think it's like when you're backed into a corner and you have no other means of providing for yourself. But the reason why they end up being in those positions where they are sex workers is because they don't necessarily have access to opportunities to improve themselves and their quality of life, right? So that being either employment opportunities, education, whatever the case may be. Not that I'm not shaming sex work at all. Anyway, I'm pro sex work. Okay, it needs to get legalized so that it can get regulated so that our sex workers can be protected. Awesome. Next is like just this conversation about like how trans individuals have like this lack of access to like generic basics like hormones, like healthcare. So like there's this clip from like Orange is the New Black where Laverne Cox's character, they either reduce or they remove her access to hormones, and this has like basically lethal effects to them, and the general public doesn't necessarily know like what the effects are of you not necessarily having like access to your hormones, right? So I think in that case, because there's like a lack of knowledge, you know, because like trans individuals aren't necessarily at the forefront of the LGBT movement, it's kind of hard for people to gauge how important certain things are. Even in the cases where people have like an understanding that like you go through this hormonal change process, I feel like there's like a lack of knowledge or like a lot of misinterpretations of what this process necessarily means, right? Cool. I also want to say, like, with regards to having this conversation, because I will say that I do understand that I'm a South African woman, having a South African experience, but I do reference like a lot of American and or Western references. I reference a lot of references, right? Anyway, but the reason I do so is like in my mind, right? Western states are a lot more liberal, right? Like they're a lot more quote unquote advanced, I guess. So whenever you have like some sort of like, although South Africa is seen as one of like the most has one of the most progressive constitutions, which is, it's just like a kind of like a mind fuck on its own. But anyway, I see Western states being more liberal, therefore being more open-minded. I do think in recent times, in terms of like American politics and stuff like that, that may not necessarily be as true as we think it is. I think a lot more people are more conservative. They're just less open about it. Yeah, but anyway, so like in my mind, it's like because Western states are a lot more like liberal, a lot more progressive, a lot more advanced because they're first world countries, then therefore the proportionality of like discrimination there is definitely exacerbated in South Africa, right? Or in Africa generally, you know? People generally think like if you, for example, this may be graphic, take an albino person and you commit violent acts against them and like wabape or whatever the case may be, that it cures HIV. You know, like there's still like those vibes happening in South Africa, or Africa rather generally. And I do think that homophobia in Africa is a lot less, I mean, the LGBT movement broadly is a lot less understood in Africa than it is in the Western areas, right? So that's pretty much why I make that comparative. But I also feel like, with regards to my experiences, at least with my sexuality, I experienced a lot of biphobia when I identified as bi. So in my mind, if there's like a lot of biphobia, a lot of panphobia that I've experienced within the movement, then I don't understand why it's been, as mentioned before, like there's a lot of like resistance with regards to having this conversation. I don't understand why people aren't willing to have this conversation openly and say, listen, we are in the movement, and yes, there is transphobia. Listen, we are in the movement and there is biphobia. You know, there's actually like, I watched this documentary, I said discourse. What the fuck is that? Disclosure. Woo! And they speak about like transphobia or the trans experience generally, and there's this like very beautiful piece where they talk about why there's transphobia within the LGBTQIA plus movement. They even reference everything it is that I referenced, and they speak about how like one major thing about American culture, which I think filters into the rest of the world, I will say, especially in terms of media, in terms of representation, is one thing about American culture is like assimilation is a very big part of American culture, right? So outside of like the queer community, we can talk about how Black culture and how like assimilating is really important. You know, like you can do anything if you sound white over the third, you know, or like in The Hate You Give, they talk about how Star basically code switches and how she has to basically alter her identity when she's in the more whiter areas or in the whiter school, so that she's not affiliated with being ghetto. So assimilation is a very large part of that culture, and how trans individuals actively question or actively, what is this? They actively engage with this idea of assimilation, and that's hated on within the community, because it makes it hard for those that can assimilate to assimilate. So we'll just insert that so that it's easier for people to understand. But like in closing, right, a couple of fun facts actually about transgender experiences, or the trans community rather, is like you can actually actively apply for gender reassignment surgery in South Africa. You just need to come up with a couple of documents. We'll definitely insert that in the screen. Same-sex marriage was legalized in like 2004, 2003. Gender reassignment was acknowledged by the government in like 2006, so that's super dope. I thoroughly love that. But also, I think we're generally just going to add some helplines. Come in. Sorry. Anyway, so we'll just link helplines for individuals within the community. That may need some assistance, right? Whether it's information, whether it's just generic help. Maybe you're struggling with the homophobia. We're here for you. So I think in terms of like my closing thoughts on the subject matter, it's more so based around this whole having a seat at the table theory, right? And I do think that conversation is like it's more so like okay, I don't believe in binary systems in general. It does that nothing. I think there's like a bit of a gray area, especially with situations like this, right? So let me quickly loosely define what having a seat at the table implies. So the loose definition of what having a seat at the table means is like when we look at women or people of color or previously like disadvantaged or marginalized groups of people being invited to like this hypothetical table. So be it a company or a boardroom or whatever the table is, right? And in theory, when that individual or those people get to that table, they should have the same opportunities as everyone else in the table to listen, to contribute, to define and influence whatever the output or whatever the final decisions that are being discussed at that table are, right? So unfortunately, more often than not, having a seat at the table is just more so about having like a token piece, which is just my stance on it. And, you know, people end up being expected, rather, even if it's not like directly expressed, to just sit there and smile and just smile and wave, you know, and nod and agree with what everyone is saying. But you can't necessarily be outspoken or like really opinionated about whatever it is that's being discussed in those places. So now that we got that out of the way, I just want to quickly reference a video, or an interview rather, that Gabrielle Union had on The Real a couple of years ago discussing this topic.
What we love about you is your outspokenness. And in regards to black representation, you made the quote, "I don't even want a seat at your table. We built a new house."
Yeah, I love that.
Can you elaborate?
Well, I think for so long, so many of us have been clamoring to get in the room, much less a seat at a table that was never really built for us, in a house that had been historically oppressive to us. So why even try to keep fighting to get in that house? We built a new house. It's over in Wakanda. I've currently got a timeshare. It's Wakanda adjacent.
I think with regards to Gabrielle Union's comments about like building your own house, not necessarily opting into taking a seat at the table, I'll say like it's mainly one of two arguments, but I'm more in the middle, right? It's like, on one hand, you know, taking a seat at the table, you know, signifies representation, having accurate representation. I mean, the more representation you have, the more likely it is that the portrayal of whatever that marginalized group is will be accurate, right? And I think that also signifies where we were, where we came from, and where we are now, and the amount of progress that's been made. And I think especially more so with what, you know, we've discussed in this video, and more so in Disclosure, where they talk about like the representation of trans individuals in media, for example, and how like the more representation there will be, then the more accurate the portrayals of it or of those individuals will be. Awesome source. I definitely get that. Then on the other side, it's more so about like building your own spaces. I'm more for like creating your own spaces, you know, like the whole conversation around integration, you know, around, you know, entering those spaces that weren't necessarily made for you kind of puts me off, because I do think that people have the capacity to create their own spaces, you know, for them, you know, made for them. It's kind of hard fighting against the system that, you know, the system works perfectly, basically, is what I'm saying, you know. So why not create your own system? In the past, there were like communities that were thriving, you know, like black communities during slavery that were like independent economies that were thriving, right? I do think that individuals that are marginalized have power in numbers, you know. And if we all came together, ideally, in air quotations, there would be some sort of like upward mobility, you know. But like, I'm also in the middle with regards to that conversation around taking a seat at the table, because with regards to this conversation, it is their table, and it's more so about what makes you feel comfortable. But the first step to recovery is acceptance, I'll say, and people actively acknowledging what the issue is and how they contribute to the issue, you know, like at least check your privilege, you know. I need to check my privilege, heterosexual individuals need to check their privilege and see what the best way forward would be, you know. So that's pretty much it. Please comment down below. I don't necessarily have more of an opinion on it. I just thought it'd be like an interesting conversation to have, but I don't necessarily have more of an opinion on it because it's not my decision to make at the end of the day, you know. But yeah, thanks for watching the video. Thanks for making it to the end of the video. Please do comment down below. I really hope that this was insightful, and yeah, do like, you know, do share if you care, you know, and I'll see you in the next video.